There is a moment every narcissist fears more than abandonment, more than rejection, more than being called out in front of a room full of people. It is the moment they finally understand what they actually lost. Not a supply source, not a convenient audience, not someone to perform for. They lost the one real, unguarded love that ever tried to reach them, and they were the one who killed it. Not fate, not circumstance. Their own hands, their own choices, their own refusal to be honest for even a single moment. That is the breaking point we are talking about today. The exact second the mask cracks and the person underneath has to admit what they built was never a home. It was a trap set for someone else, and somehow they ended up living inside it too. If you have ever loved someone like this, you already know the strange contradiction at its center. They seemed certain, composed, in control of every room they entered. Underneath that certainty was something closer to panic. Control was never really about winning. It was about not losing, which is a very different thing. A person who is truly secure does not need to manage every interaction like a chess match, test your loyalty, ration their affection, or quietly punish you for having a life outside of them. Only someone terrified of being truly seen behaves that way. So while it looked like power from the outside, what you were actually watching was fear wearing an expensive costume. Here is the part almost no one tells you. The narcissist is not simply cruel. Cruelty implies intention aimed outward, a person who knows exactly what they are doing and does it anyway for pleasure. What we are describing is something else, something sadder in its own broken way. It is a person so disconnected from their own emptiness that they built an entire identity to keep from feeling it. Every compliment they gave you, every grand gesture, every perfectly timed apology was not proof of love. It was maintenance. It was upkeep on a performance that had to keep running because the moment it stopped, they would have to sit alone with the truth of who they actually are. That is why the beginning always feels like magic. They mirror you. They study your wounds, your dreams, your specific loneliness, and they hand it back to you dressed up as destiny. You think you found someone who finally understands you completely, when in reality you found someone who is extremely good at listening for exactly what you need to hear. That is not intimacy. That is reconnaissance. And once they know which words unlock you, they use them like a key, not because they feel them, but because they work. This is where the story usually turns painful. But I want you to notice something important before we go further. The fact that it worked on you is not a flaw in your character. It is proof that you know how to love with your whole chest, without armor, without constant suspicion. That is rare. That is not weakness, no matter what the relationship trained you to believe. The tragedy is not that you were capable of that kind of love. The tragedy is who you gave it to, because somewhere in the middle of all that warmth, the temperature starts to change. The compliments get quieter or sharper, sometimes both in the same sentence. The attention that once felt like sunlight starts arriving on a schedule, present when you are useful, absent when you are not, and slowly, without ever naming it, you start adjusting yourself. You get smaller, you get more careful. You start rehearsing conversations in your head before you have them, trying to predict which version of them will show up today. That exhausting vigilance is not love either. That is survival dressed up as devotion, and it will drain you long before you understand what is actually happening. What makes this especially disorienting is that the shift is never loud enough to point to. There is no single moment you can hold up as evidence, just 1,000 small subtractions, an eroded sense of your own judgment, replaced by theirs. You stop trusting your gut because you have been quietly taught that your gut is the problem. That is not an accident. That is the entire architecture of the relationship, built one quiet contradiction at a time, until you cannot tell the difference between your intuition and their narrative anymore. But here is the piece they never see coming, the piece this entire story hinges on. Somewhere inside every person who has been slowly dimmed like this, there is a moment of return. It does not usually arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically, in the middle of an ordinary day, when you catch yourself apologizing for something that was never your fault, And for the first time you actually hear it. You hear the shape of your own voice bending itself around someone else's comfort, and something in you refuses to keep doing it. That refusal, small as it feels in the moment, is the beginning of the end for them, even though they have no idea it just happened. Because the narcissist's entire structure depends on your reaction. Your hurt, your confusion, your desperate attempts to fix things, all of it feeds the system. It is the fuel. The moment you stop supplying it is the moment the machine has nothing left to run on. And that, more than any argument, any confrontation, any dramatic goodbye, is what actually breaks them. Not your anger, your absence of reaction. We are going to walk through exactly how that shift happens, why it terrifies them more than anything else they will ever face, and what it costs them the fature. Instant they realize the love they destroyed is never coming back in the form they once had it. Let's go back to the moment before anything cracked, because you cannot understand the fall without understanding the height they built it from. Every narcissist starts the same performance with a familiar opening act, and it works because it is designed by someone who has spent years studying exactly what makes people feel chosen, not loved. Chosen. There is a difference, and it is the difference that will matter most by the end of this story. Being chosen feels incredible in the moment. It feels like being pulled out of a crowd, singled out, finally seen after years of feeling invisible in your own relationships. That is precisely the point. The narcissist is not offering you connection. They are offering you contrast, and contrast is easy to manufacture when someone has spent real time studying your specific loneliness. Suddenly you are the exception, the one who is different from everyone who came before you, the one who finally gets it. And because that feeling is so rare, so intoxicating, you do not stop to ask why it arrives so fast, why it feels so complete so early, why someone you barely know already seems to understand you better than people who have loved you for years. Real love does not need to prove itself in week one. It reveals itself slowly, gradually, through consistency, through the boring, unglamorous repetition of showing up the same way on hard days as on easy ones. But this is not that. This is a highlight reel running on fast forward, because a highlight reel is all a narcissist actually has. There is no slow season for them. No quiet Tuesday where they simply exist beside you without performing. Everything is calibrated for effect, and effect requires intensity, which is why the beginning always feels like the best chapter of a movie rather than the opening pages of an actual life together. Here is the contrast that matters most. Genuine affection asks nothing of you in return for existing. It does not require gratitude, does not track what it has given, does not quietly file away your reactions to use against you later. But if you look closely at that early flood of attention, you will notice it is never free. It is a deposit, made specifically so that a withdrawal can be justified later. Every grand gesture becomes a debt you did not know you were accumulating, and one day, without warning, the collection notice arrives disguised as disappointment. You didn't appreciate what I did for you. You've changed. You used to be so much more grateful. Suddenly you are the one apologizing, the one scrambling to restore a warmth that was manufactured in the first place, and you have no idea how you ended up on defense in a relationship you didn't even realize had turned into a courtroom. This is where so many people get quietly stuck, and I want to name it clearly, because clarity is the very thing the entire relationship was designed to slowly take from you. You start to believe the coldness is your fault. You start auditing your own behavior, searching for the flaw, the mistake, the moment you supposedly broke something that was, in truth, never stable to begin with. This is not a character flaw in you. This is the entirely predictable result of being trained, slowly and methodically, to distrust your own perception. And once that training takes hold, the narcissist does not even need to work very hard anymore. You do the work for them. You police your own tone. You second-guess your own memory. You apologize before you even know what you're apologizing for. But something interesting happens the longer this pattern repeats, something the narcissist never accounts for because it contradicts everything their strategy depends on. Exhaustion, eventually, becomes its own kind of clarity. Somewhere in the 100th apology for something that was never your fault, a small, quiet voice starts asking a very dangerous question. What if it isn't me? That question, once it takes root, cannot be uprooted again. It sits there, patient, gathering evidence every time the pattern repeats, until one day it is no longer a whisper. It is a conclusion. This is the part of the story the narcissist has no script for, because their entire method assumes you will keep looking inward for the problem instead of outward at the pattern. They are extraordinary at managing your reactions. They are completely unprepared for your realization. Reactions can be manipulated, redirected, punished, or rewarded. A realization cannot be argued with because it does not live in the same emotional register as the fights and the silences and the makeups. It lives somewhere quieter, somewhere more permanent, and once it settles in, the entire 2D architecture of control built on top of your confusion starts to lose its foundation. What makes this moment so important is that it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no slammed door, no screaming match, no cinematic exit. Often it looks like nothing at all. You simply stop reaching for your phone the way you used to. You stop rehearsing your defense before conversations. You start noticing with a strange, almost clinical detachment, the exact moment they attempt the old tactic, the compliment that arrives right on cue, the sudden warmth after days of cold distance, and instead of melting into relief the way you once did, you just watch it happen. You see the strategy for what it is, laid bare, and it no longer moves you the way it used to. That shift from reacting to observing is the single most dangerous development for a narcissist, and we are going to spend the next section walking through exactly why it terrifies them more than any accusation ever could, and what happens in their mind the very first time they realize the performance has stopped. Working on the one audience member who used to believe every word of it. Here is something almost no one expects, and it flips the story on its head once you understand it. The narcissist does not fear your anger. Anger is familiar territory to them. Anger means you are still fighting for their attention, still reacting, tangled in the relationship in a way that keeps them relevant. A screaming match is not a threat to them. In some twisted way, it is almost comforting because it proves the connection still exists, that they still hold enough weight in your life to provoke a reaction. What terrifies them is something quieter, something they have no strategy for at all. What terrifies them is your calm. Think about what calm actually communicates. It says without a raised voice that you have stopped waiting for them to change. It says you are no longer auditioning for their approval, no longer rehearsing the version of yourself that might earn consistent affection. Calm is not indifference born of not caring. It is the specific, hard-won indifference of someone who used to care intensely and has finally run out of reasons to keep spending that energy. And there is nothing a narcissist can do with that, because their toolkit was built for a person who still hopes. Once hope leaves the room, the toolkit becomes useless. This is where the pattern usually shifts, and if you have lived through it, you will recognize the sequence instantly. First comes confusion on their end, a subtle disbelief that the old tactics no longer land. The compliment that used to soften you lands flat. The sudden warmth after days of cold distance no longer produces relief, only recognition of the pattern repeating itself. So they escalate, not always loudly. Sometimes it looks like more effort, more charm, an unexpected callback to the early days, an attempt to resurrect the version of themselves that used to work so well on you. It is, in its own way, a kind of desperation dressed up as romance. When escalation does not work either, the tone often turns. The charm gives way to blame. Suddenly you are cold, distant, ungrateful, different than you used to be, as though your growing clarity is a personal betrayal rather than a natural consequence of everything that came before it. This is one of the clearest signs the breaking point is approaching, because a person secure in their own worth does not need to punish someone for healing. Only someone who built their identity on your dependency experiences, your independence as in mocks, and attack. And here is the contrast worth sitting with for a moment. In a healthy relationship, growth is celebrated. When one person becomes more confident, more grounded, more clear about their own boundaries, the other person is glad, because a relationship built on real love wants both people to become fuller versions of themselves. But in this dynamic, your growth is treated as a threat, because a fuller version of you is a version far less willing to shrink, far less willing to apologize for things that were never your fault, far less available to be managed. Your healing does not strengthen the relationship in their eyes. It ends it, and on some level they know that before you even say a word. This is usually the point where the narcissist reaches for the tool that has worked the longest and the most reliably throughout the entire relationship, and that tool is your fear of losing them. For most of the relationship, the mere possibility of their withdrawal was enough to reorganize your behavior. A cold shoulder could make you rehearse apologies for hours. A canceled plan could send you spiraling through everything you might have done wrong. That fear was the quiet engine running underneath almost every interaction, even the good ones, because you never fully knew when the warmth might be taken away again. But something shifts once you have survived the withdrawal enough times to know, on a bone-deep level, that you can survive it. The threat of losing them stops working the same way, because you have already lived through versions of that loss over and over, disguised as silence, as coldness, as sudden distance. You already know what it feels like, and you know you are still standing. That knowledge is quietly devastating to their control, because the entire system depended on the fear of an unknown loss. Once the loss becomes familiar, even survivable, the fear loses its grip, and without fear, there is nothing left holding the old patterns together. This is the part of the story worth naming clearly, because it is the emotional center of everything we are building toward. The breaking point is not a single explosive scene. It is not a slammed door or a screamed accusation or a dramatic confrontation in the rain. It is a long, quiet accumulation of moments where you choose not to react, not to chase, not to explain yourself for the 100th time. Each one of those small refusals looks like nothing from the outside, but together they form the exact thing a narcissist cannot survive, an audience that no longer believes the performance, and a person who no longer needs their approval to feel whole. What happens next, in the space right after they realize this, is where the real unraveling begins, because they are not simply losing an argument or a partner. They are being forced, for the first time in a very long time, to sit with the version of themselves that exists without an audience watching, and that is a mirror they have spent their entire life avoiding. That avoidance did not start with you. It started long before you entered the picture, built over years of learning that being watched and admired felt safer than being known. But the price of that avoidance always comes due, and it comes due loudest in the silence left behind by the one person who finally stopped performing back. Here is the moment we have been building toward, the one the entire story hinges on. It rarely looks like the ending anyone imagines. There is no dramatic confession, no tearful admission of guilt, no cinematic moment where the narcissist finally says the words you spent years hoping to hear. That version of the ending only exists in the story you told yourself while still waiting for them to change. The real ending is quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating for them than anything they could have imagined. It happens in an ordinary moment, usually alone, unremarkable on the surface. Maybe they see a photo of you looking genuinely happy, unposed, unguarded, the kind of happiness that cannot be performed. Maybe they hear that you are doing well, building a life that has nothing to do with them, filled with people and plans and small pleasures they were never invited into. And in that instant, something lands that all the arguments and accusations never managed to land. Not guilt, not remorse in the way you might hope, something closer to dread, the dread of irrelevance, the dread of realizing they are no longer the center of anything. This is the part worth sitting with, because it reveals the actual architecture of what they built their identity on. For a narcissist, existing without an audience is not simply uncomfortable. It is existentially threatening, because much of their sense of self was never built from the inside. It was built from reflection, from the reactions of the people around them, from being needed, chased, missed, feared, wanted, resented. anything that kept them at the center of someone else's emotional weather. Take away the audience, and there is very little left standing on its own. That is the quiet horror they live with once you're gone. And it is not something you inflicted on them. It is something they built for themselves, one manipulation, one manufactured crisis, one calculated silence at a time. Contrast that with where you are standing now. You did not walk away to punish them. You did not disappear as a strategy to make them suffer or prove a point. You walked away because staying required a version of you that could not survive much longer. A version constantly negotiating, constantly shrinking, constantly translating your own needs into language soft enough not to provoke another withdrawal. Leaving was not revenge. It was oxygen. And that distinction matters because it means your peace was never dependent on their regret. You do not need them to understand what they did in order for your healing to be real. Their realization, if it ever comes, is simply a consequence of your absence, not a requirement for your recovery. This is where so many people get the story backwards, expecting the breaking point to feel like justice, like a scene where the scales finally balance, and you get to watch them pay for what they did. But real healing rarely waits for that scene, because it cannot depend on someone else's capacity for self-awareness, a capacity they may never develop. Some narcissists do reach a genuine reckoning. Many do not. Many simply move on to a new audience, recycle the same performance with fresh material, and never sit with the truth of what they destroyed. Your healing cannot be contingent on which version happens, because that would mean handing them power over your peace one final time. The exact thing you just spent so long learning to take back. What you can hold on to instead is simpler and far more solid. You survived a relationship engineered to make you doubt your own perception, and you came out able to trust yourself again. That is not small. That is the actual victory, quieter than the one you might have imagined, but far more durable. It does not depend on their apology. It does not depend on them ever grasping what they lost. It exists entirely within you, built from every moment you chose clarity over chaos, boundaries over guilt, and eventually silence over explanation. And here is the final piece of contrast worth carrying with you. The narcissist world was built on control, on making sure nothing and no one existed outside their influence. Yours does not have to be built that way. You get to build something entirely different, a life defined not by vigilance, but by ease, not by performance, but by honesty, not by a constant low hum of managing someone else's moods, but by the simple, almost startling relief of being able to just exist without bracing for impact. That contrast, more than any dramatic confrontation, is the real proof of what actually happened here. One person built a life that depended on someone else's diminishment. The other built a life that no longer needs anyone's permission to be whole. So if you recognize yourself anywhere in this story, in the slow erosion, in the second guessing, in the exhausting vigilance that once felt like love, let this be the reminder you needed. Their breaking point was never about them at all. It was always the moment you stopped breaking for them. And once that shift happens, once you choose yourself consistently enough that it stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like who you are now, there is no performance left that can pull you back into that old shape again. That is not something they took from you. That is something you built, quietly, patiently, one boundary at a time. And it belongs to you, whether they ever understand what they lost or not. You do not owe them a final word, a closing argument, or a perfectly composed explanation. You already gave your answer the day you chose peace over chasing, and nothing on their side of the story can take that back. Let them keep the mask. You kept the truth, and the truth was always the only thing worth walking away with.